think it's because you're here. My name is Mike. I get to serve on team here at Expectation, and I want to say welcome to everyone, especially those watching online as well. Our lead pastor, Pastor Christian, is away this weekend. He is performing a wedding ceremony for some friends, and so he asked me to fill in. But we have been walking through a series together, a collection of talks, and we're going to continue in that today, and we're going to conclude it next week. And so if today's your first time to Expectation, man, I'm so glad that you're here. We're so glad you're here. I would encourage you to come back and hear from Pastor Christian next week. But I hope that today you have felt seen and celebrated and welcomed in this place. That's our heart. And also, I know it's summer. I know a lot of travel has been happening, so maybe you've been gone for a few weeks. But if you missed one of the previous messages in this series, would highly encourage you at some point to just go back. They're on our YouTube channel. You can find them. Just search Expectation Church. But go to this series, the Prologue. John chapter 1 is what we'll be walking through, because the past 2 weeks have been really, really powerful. And Pastor Christian has walked us through. The Prologue is the first 18 verses of the first chapter in the book of John. And Pastor Christian's done a great job kind of setting this up for us and walking us through it. And I'm going to recap a little bit today, hopefully give some cliff notes just in case you weren't here the last few weeks. But the Gospel of John is so impactful and so powerful. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they kick off the New Testament. They are the synoptic Gospels, and they're fairly similar in kind of their rhythm, in their content. And the book of John, it kind of just like goes rogue and breaks the mold a little bit. And I think something like 90% of the Gospel of John is unique to the others. And so we kind of wanted to dive into this, and we've been walking through it together. But I'm curious to know, how many of you like spoilers? Like, you're the person who watches the show and you've got to look up online to see who the girl ends up with at the end of this series, at the end of this thing, because you just can't stand the tension of not knowing who's going to win this thing, how it's going to turn out, what the surprise ending is going to be. Well, I have a spoiler for you today. As we get into the book of John, what I want to do is I want to jump to the end of the book really fast, because we get a spoiler as to why this whole thing really is written. And so before we get into reading our text for today, we're going to jump to the end. We're going to go to John chapter 20, verse 31, where simply John just says, hey, but these are written. What's been written? Everything he just wrote. So we're in John chapter 20 here, so everything that he writes, right? These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So spoiler, this whole thing is about Jesus. It's only ever always about Jesus. And John does a beautiful job throughout this gospel of making sure that he is the primary, that Jesus is the primary, that Jesus takes center stage. And so what we're going to be reading about today, man, these things were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Okay, we've got that. We get it. Know the ending, know the spoiler. Now let's jump back to the beginning here. And today our text that we're really going to focus on, it's going to come through verses 9 through 13, but I really want to start at verse 1 and get through all of it really quick, just to make sure that we're all up to speed, and just in case some of you maybe weren't here the last few weeks, just to give some full context. And also, if you have a smart device, if you have a smartphone, you can always download the YouVersion Bible app. And every single week, if you go to the events tab, you can find Expectation Church. And we post, like, everything you see on the screen, you'll find on your phone in the notes there every single week. And so you can always follow along. If you're like, wait, what was that? I missed it. Go back. It's there. Like, it's all there for you. So YouVersion Bible app, make sure you download that. It's a great resource. But with that, let's dive in to our text for today. So John chapter 1, verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. And then verse 9, this is our really centered text that we're focusing on today. Verse 9, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. I know that's a lot that we just read there, and there's a whole bunch packed into that. Again, go back, watch the last 2 weeks. But what we get in this passage is this beautiful reminder as God is coming onto the scene that God wants to be with us. It's this beautiful reminder that God desires to be with us. He wants to be in relationship with us. He wants to know us. And as we read John chapter 1, you might see there that there are reflections of Genesis chapter 1, which is the opening chapter of the Bible. It is the creation story that features God bringing light out of darkness. You see, we as human beings, we have a proclivity towards the darkness, and it is reflected through the story of humanity. But this story is not a story of punishment. This is not a story of condemnation, but this is a story of redemption, of sacrificial love, one of a loving father continually drawing his beloved out of the darkness and into the light. I am one of the last generations that remembers what life was like before the internet. Like when you had to talk to people face to face, when you wanted to call someone, you had to call them on your home phone, and you had that long cord that I would string that thing all through every bend and turn in my house, and it get all tangled up, trying to get some privacy from mom and dad. You go into the closet, go into the bathroom. Dial-up speed, hello. Dad's on the computer, don't pick up the phone. What? Like, that doesn't even make sense now. Like, just in my lifetime, technology has changed so fast. It has come so far. And so it's really easy to forget that it wasn't until about 1925 that electricity in the home, at least in the US, became much more affordable and became widespread. And so we so easily take for granted how we just go into our house and we just flip the switch and there it is. But see, in ancient times, light was precious. In order to have light, you had to wait for the sun to rise, or you'd have to gather and prepare and burn away fuel sources. Light was precious. It still is precious. It was, and it still is, a source of life. I mean, much of what grows in the light brings us life, right? Our plants grow in the light, and animals eat that, and we eat that. And so much of our life source comes from the light. In the light, man, you can see the path before you. You can see obstructions that are in the way, and you can navigate through them. In the light, there is safety because everything is seen for what it truly is. And while the light represents life, darkness represents death. See, plants and people will die without enough light and the warmth that comes from it. In the dark, there is ignorance, both physically and intellectually. There's fear in the dark, for we can't see things for what they truly are. And things don't just grow in the light. There are things that grow in the dark too. And so there are a lot of things that we can identify physically about our growth. Like we see as our children are growing, we take them to the doctor, we get checkups. Even as adults, there are indicators whether we are on a healthy trajectory or an unhealthy trajectory. There's signs that we can see of that. But how do you know if you are growing spiritually? If you're positioned in the light or in the dark? How do you know if you're growing spiritually? Is it determined by how much money you give? Is it determined by how often you volunteer at events? Is it determined by how many e-groups or small groups you're a part of? Is it determined by how many Sundays you attend church? Doing things for God is not the same as becoming like God. And see, the danger is it's very possible for a church to be filled with people integrated into programs and still not be growing spiritually. It's possible to be very religious and very involved and still not transformed. And this is why it's significant where we get to verse 9. John writes to us, he says, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world." He says the true light. True meaning real or genuine, so not an imitation, not fake, not pretend, not phony, not synthetic. It is a light that is pure and unpolluted, a light that is more powerful than we could ever imagine, a light that dispels the darkness of sin and unbelief. You see, with the rise in artificial intelligence recently, the lines between what is authentic and what is artificial are thinning. What's real? What's not? What's true? What's not? Studying this week a little bit, I came across this article that talked about artificial light versus sunlight. And I just found this so interesting. It says artificial light emits on a much narrower spectrum than the sun. However, due to the fantastic compensatory, use that word this week, ability in our eyes and our lack of perception outside the visible spectrum, this remains hidden from us at first glance. So at first glance, artificial and real seem to be the same. Like I can't tell the difference at first glance. What's real? What's not? Recently at the Sony World Photography Awards, I love taking photos. It's a hobby of mine, photographer. But recently at the Sony World Photography Awards, the German artist Boris Eldegsen, he had submitted this photo. And he won a prestigious award with it. The issue, however, is that he refused to receive and accept that award because he didn't take this photo. In fact, nobody took this photo because he submitted this photo after creating it with artificial intelligence. Looks real, looks to be the real thing. It's not. It's a fake. It's an imitation. It's a phony. The Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy writes to his protege, Timothy, he says, "Preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season." And then some of our favorite words in church here, he says, correct, rebuke, encourage with great patience and careful instruction. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. So I don't want you to miss this. There is a sound doctrine, comes from the source that is a real, it is genuine, it is authentic, comes from God. And then there is a doctrine of desire, something that fits my desires and my personal preference. But you see, the photo looks real, seems to be authentic, but it's fake. It is not the true light. There have been so many attempts throughout history to bring light in many different formats into our world. People have used science, they've used religion, they used political structures, right? Scientists have tried to create inventions that would extend fuel sources. Political structures where, if adopted, promise to bring peace and safety and provision, and religious or political leaders claiming to be the light for the people of their generation. There's even a recent time of history that we call the Enlightenment, right? Where we believed that through scientific advancement, through human philosophy or human ingenuity, that we could solve the major problems of the world. And while, yes, of course, we can look back at that time of that period of time, and we can say that there were some good things that came out of it, many of these same scientific and philosophical advancements were used to advance warfare, hatred, lies, corruption, abuse. And here we are in 2023, generations past that period of time when the light bulb and electricity is common in our day. I think that we can all still agree that we live in a very dark time. So John says Jesus is the true light. But what he's doing in verse 9 is he's setting the stage for a massive rejection in verse 10. John writes, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. So Jesus, he came into the world that he made, the world that he simply just spoke into existence. He came to what belongs to him by right of creation. He came to his own possession, his own domain. He came to the house of humanity. We just read in John 1, verse 3, it said that through him all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to him. And one theologian says this, he says, John lays the basis for the supreme irony in the story of Jesus. He created the world, yet it did not know him. He was in the world, but the world, although it owed its existence to him, failed nevertheless to recognize him. It says, the world did not recognize him. Some translations might say, did not know him. I'm curious today, I want to throw a picture up on the screen behind me, and there's an arrow. How many of you, by just show of hands, know of who that is? How many of you know of who that is? Okay, a decent amount of people, still a lot that don't. It's okay if you don't. I didn't know who that was. Apparently, that is the top third, like one of the top 3 most famous people in the world right now, just to make everyone aware. How many of you that are aware of him, how many would say that maybe you know some things about him? Like you know what he does for a living. Like you know, okay, so we're a little familiar, right? Maybe we could share some things with those who don't. So next photo, this is Lionel Messi, who is the star player, some would say the GOAT. And he played for the Argentina national team, recently leading them to be World Cup champions. So kind of a big topic of conversation if you're in that. And then even more recently, he just signed with Inter Miami in Miami, Florida, which is where my wife is from. And so I tell you what, they like that. They like it. They like it a lot. And so it's interesting how there are varying levels of recognition. Like there are some of you who obviously know of him. And there are some of you who know some things about him. You know what teams he plays for. Maybe his teammates could, give me some of his stats. Does anybody in the room know him personally? Which if you do, please come talk to me after the service. I would love to. Like it wouldn't be awkward for you to have his number and to give him a call. Do you know what his favorite movie is? Are you familiar with what kinds of foods he likes or he dislikes? How he takes his coffee. Does he even like coffee? Does he drink it at all? What does he do for fun? Who are the people that he holds closest and dearest to him? What upsets him? What does he hate? What breaks his heart? You see, there's a lot of people who know of God. A lot of people who claim to know a lot about God. But do you know him? Do you have a relationship with him? And I want to hit pause and just take a side note here. I think we need to be very careful, just in general, especially as God's people. I think we need to be very careful with whom we speak of that we do not know. We can be really good at this in the church. And it happens, it's just kind of part of what comes with it, but people say things about our church. I have friends who have the honor of getting to share God's word. I have friends who have the honor of getting to lead others in worship on a stage. And sometimes you get in circles and things people will say, I just don't like the way that I'm just not really a fan, of how they just, it just feels inauthentic. It just kind of feels like theatrical. I don't know. I just not really a fan. I've heard about that church. Yeah. Oof. Yeah. Do you know them? Do you know their heart? Have you sat at a table with them and broken bread and you have a relationship with them? I think we need to be really careful with whom we speak of that we do not know. That is a child of God. Parents in the room, I'm wondering how you might react or what your response would be if somebody were to come to you and say, hey, I'm just not really liking how your kid's doing that. Moms in the room, hello. I think of 1 Samuel, where God's people had a preference. They liked it a certain way. They wanted something specific. They wanted a king. And Samuel knew God's heart. He had a relationship with the true light. And he tried to steer and guide and lead them towards what God wanted. But the people of God, they rejected him. They said, no, give us what we want. We want our preference. And Samuel's broken over this, and God comes to Samuel and he says, Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And so the next time, I get it. I've got preferences too. I've got things that I like too. And that's fine, that's okay. But the next time something maybe is going on in here and you just don't like and you don't want, maybe instead of maybe you don't say something, but maybe look internally. Maybe God is using that person's light to reveal something dark in my own heart. And so we got to be real careful with what we say with whom we do not know. Jesus is so much more concerned with relationship. He is so much more concerned with your relational connection to him than your religious comprehension of him. Do you know him? How are you able to recognize, yes, that's of God? You ever have someone who you got a note from? This doesn't sound like them. I don't think it's them. How do you know? Because you know them. You know how they speak. You know how they act. You know who they are. How do you know if this is from God? According to the United States Department of Treasury, an estimated $70 million in counterfeit bills are in circulation. Do you know how experts are able to identify counterfeit currency? It's not by spending time with the fakes. It's not by spending time with the phonies. It's by becoming an expert in genuine currency. This is how we know, by building our relationship with God, by spending time with him. We've got to spend time in his word. We got to get to know him. So that way, when we see something and we identify something that is not of God, it is clear. That's the real thing. The true light, the real light. John goes on in verse 11, he says, he came to that which was his own, but it did not receive him. Some translations say it rejected him. He came to his own people and they rejected him. Have you ever experienced the heartbreak of rejection from those whom you expected to love you the most? John chapter 3, John goes on later, he says in verse 19, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. I think the rejection of God's own people is one of the greatest barriers of the gospel today. And I think there's a really small, minimal amount of people who don't just know of God and know about God, but know him and go, no, rejecting, pushing away. I think more often than not, the majority are, well, I'm not rejecting God. I'm not adamantly, no, I'm not rejecting him, but I mean, yeah, maybe there's like this portion over here that I haven't like fully, like I won't give that. I don't know if I subscribe to this portion or this section that's really in line with kind of what I feel or think. I think one of the things that breaks the heart of God the most is when those who claim to carry his name misrepresent his character. When people claim to know and claim to follow God, to be his own people, and yet be a misrepresentation of who he really is. And so what we see happening in our world and our culture begins to creep into the church, capital C church, where we operate by this kind of self-definition and self-standards where, man, love is just love, and this is my truth, and you just, you do what you do, whatever works, whatever works for you. And there's this kind of like reductionism that happens where you kind of pick everything apart and you analyze the pieces and you dismiss what God teaches or what he has to say about something. This is what we read in Romans chapter 1, where it says that they did not acknowledge him as God. Timothy Keller, who recently passed away, but he was a pastor in New York City for years. He's an author, high intellect, very smart, amazing writer, speaker, teacher. He says this. He says, do you know what plagiarism is? When you're referencing something and you take credit for another's work. He says, the modern self is doing plagiarism of existence. when you are refusing to acknowledge God as the source of your very being and your life, and you're taking credit for the work. Whew. Whew. I think the result of so much of this is why we're seeing so much fragmentation in the church today. I mean, why would people choose to follow a God with whom his own people have rejected? See, I think for far too long, the church has been giving the wrong message to the wrong people. See, the gospel is the good news. It's the good news about Jesus coming to this world, dying for us so that we might have eternal life in him. And who is the good news for? The good news is for non-believers. It's for those who have yet to commit their lives to Christ. And so it doesn't matter who you are. I have good news for you. Jesus died for you. It doesn't matter where you've been. I have good news for you. Jesus died for you. It doesn't matter what you've done. I have good news for you. Jesus died for you. It doesn't matter how broken and jacked up your past is and what's gone on. I have good news for you. Jesus died for you. And so we get someone who says, okay, cool. I want to follow this Jesus. I want to surrender my life to him. I want to chase after him. Wonderful. I now have bad news for you. He died for you. You're going to have to die for him. He got on the cross. You're going to have to carry your cross. See, for far too long, the church has been giving good news to the church and bad news to the world. And so we'll argue with people on social media. Man, we'll go to a parade and we'll picket that we feel like, hey, this doesn't align or agree with my theology, but we won't stop any of the sin happening in our own lives. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, he says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Like, this isn't my assignment. That's not why I'm here. He says, but it is to judge those inside the church who are sinning. And so we have Christians who are trying to correct the behaviors of those who are still walking in darkness while simultaneously pushing into the shadows our own issues that God has already exposed in the light. Russell Moore wrote an article this week titled, "The American Evangelical Church is in Crisis." And in it, he talks about the state of the church and how if things don't shift, if things don't change, he says, we will lose a generation longing to see whether the gospel is real or just another means to mobilize voters or market to customers. Is this the real thing? Is this genuine? Is this sincere? And if the story ended here, it would be rather grim. I know today has been hard-hitting. That's not my heart or my intent. But just as there was a sharp antithesis earlier between darkness and light, so there is an equally direct contrast between rejection and reception. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read these last two verses. I'm going to call the band forward, and we're going to wrap up here really quickly. But verse 12 says this, "Yet to all who did receive him." And so everything that we just read about and everything that we kind of just went over, if we could kind of package that, if we could take all of that, we can now, in verse 12, this can be the banner that goes over everything that we just read. It says, "Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God." Pastor Christian said this a few months ago, and I thought it was so good. He reminded us that we are all God's creation, yes, but we are not all God's children. It says he gave the right to become children of God. You can't become what you already are. And not only that, I think we all have an understanding that there are many men who become fathers through creation and biology, but they fail to be fathers bearing the weight and responsibility of one. John kind of goes on to talk about this rebirth, and he talks more about this in chapter 3, where he says, what is born from the flesh is flesh, but what is born from the spirit is spirit. And so birth into the family of God is quite different from physical birth, which involves heritage and natural descent and blood relation and race. All of these things irrelevant when it comes to being admitted into the family of God. I want to show you guys, I have a photo, a childhood photo of my sister and I. We are practically identical. I don't know what happened to the curls. I need that suit though. I could use that today. That's my sister. It's my sister Michelle. She's 6 years older than me. My sister and I, man, we had no rights to the upbringing that we were given. There was nothing that we did, like nothing that we could have done to earn it. She and I, if you can't tell by looking at the photo, she and I, we share absolutely zero DNA with each other and with either of our parents as well. See, she and I were both adopted. And so I became a legal son, and my sister a legal daughter to Anthony and Kathy. We got another family photo of us here. Jenkos, hello. Anybody? Teenagers, take note. That outfit is still big on me today. And so my sister and I, man, we were joyfully admitted to membership into this insanely loving, generous, caring, fun family called This Is Alphos. And we were given new identities. We had a new family. We had new opportunities. So much that we inherited simply because our parents chose us. Man, this is what God does. He chooses us and he gives us the right to become children of God. Paul says in Romans 8, verse 16, he says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. And in Galatians 4, he writes, he says, when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. And 1 John 3 says, see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. In other words, if you become a child of God, you become an heir to all that God owns. All that belongs to God becomes your inheritance. Do you know him? Like a child knows his father. We'll wrap up with this. One more quote from Timothy Keller, because I just thought this was just so good. He says, the gospel is this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe, yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. This is the only kind of relationship that will really transform us. Love without truth is sentimentality. It supports and affirms us, but keeps us in denial about our flaws. Truth without love is harshness. It gives us information, but in such a way that we cannot really hear it. God's saving love in Christ, however, is marked by both radical truthfulness about who we are and yet also radical, unconditional commitment to us. The merciful commitment strengthens us to see the truth about ourselves and repent. The conviction and repentance moves us to cling to and rest in God's mercy and grace. John said, "These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Man, step into the light today. And God has so much for you. He wants to know you intimately and personally.